Well, I think it could be a game changer. Last year, Ukraine's military budget was just $6 billion. Now we're talking about it being 20 billion or more, because other NATO countries are also giving weapons and money. There is a question about whether the Ukrainians can really absorb all that. But you know, I was talking to some mid-level commanders yesterday, and they were saying that already the military weapons that are coming in, the aid that's coming in, is making a difference. They were in the Kherson area. For the first 6 weeks, the Russians were making gains all the time. But in the last 10 days or so, as more weapons have been coming in, they say they've been pushing back, and they have been able to get the Russians behind certain lines, and they have been able to retake some villages. They say that the NLAWs, which are the British supplied anti-tank weapons, sort of fire and forget, they're mobile, that they're particularly useful. But also there's going to be a lot of artillery coming in. So I think that this is going to make a huge difference to this war.
Fire and forget, but not for the Russians perhaps. How is this changing the strategy, their strategy, on the ground?
Well, I think that they will be quite concerned about this. According to the Pentagon, they're advancing at about 2 kilometers a day at the moment into the Donbass area, which they're trying to take larger areas of. Now, that may be because they don't want to advance too fast, because they just can't keep the supply lines up. In other words, they have to keep feeding their soldiers, and they can't if they go too fast. And I was talking to people this morning, villagers, who said, you know, the Russians have got nothing to eat. They come and take food from us. But, you know, I think that this is also going to be difficult for Ukrainians, because although many Ukrainians want this aid, they want to beat the Russians. What it means is that the war may go on longer. It means that there may be more fighting. It means that Ukrainians may be firing artillery more into areas which the Russians control at the moment, but which have Ukrainian civilians. So you have a danger of Ukrainian civilians being killed by Ukrainian artillery. So this is not cost-free. The Russians, I think, will be looking at this with a lot of alarm. The Ukrainians are also taking the war to Russia. There were more attacks apparently this morning in Belgorod, which is just over the border in Russia. I think it will put the Russians on the defensive, but this is going to make a huge difference to this war.
Lindsay Hilson, thank you very much indeed. Well, tributes have been paid to a British former soldier who's reportedly been killed in Ukraine. Scott Sibley is believed to have been fighting in support of Ukrainian forces. The Foreign Office has confirmed that it's currently supporting the families of a British national who's died and another who is missing, although they have declined to confirm their names. Now, since the war started in February, the world's focus has been on refugees from Ukraine heading west. But the United Nations High Commission for Refugees estimates that more than 600,000 of them are now in Russia. Some went there by choice, but many others had no other choice, no other place safe to flee to. So those coming from occupied areas of Ukraine pass through a series of so-called filtration camps where they are screened by Russian authorities. Now some of those are seeking safety in the EU via Estonia. Porrick O'Brien reports now from the Estonian border town of Narva.
The border crossing at Narva between Estonia and Russia, a face-off between fortresses. On the Estonian side, selfies and smiles belie the trauma of the 300 or so Ukrainian refugees who every day now come through here via Russia. Where are you all from? Mariupol?
Azovstal, левый берег, рядом, там, ой, там страшно, там страшно.
Did you go through the filtration camps in Russia?
Да.
In the Russian media, these filtration centers, where Ukrainian refugees are screened ahead of being brought into the country, are presented as humanitarian lifelines. But this is how Ukraine's ambassador to Estonia described the process to us.
These deportations remind of very dark pages of our history. So what we see is actually the continuation of the Stalin deportations.
We've interviewed several Ukrainian refugees who've been through the filtration centres to try to understand exactly how they work. The first stop for those fleeing Mariupol, for example, and heading east, are Russian evacuation points. Why did you decide to go to the Russian evacuation point as opposed to trying to go west into Ukraine?
Ну, тут все очевидно, потому что тогда мы бы просто не дошли, потому что тогда по радио были новости о том, что ехали люди, не доехали, их убили.
Sonia is just 17. We met her and her boyfriend in the Estonian capital, Tallinn. They're from the left bank of Mariupol. They spent a month in the basement of their building, then decided to make a break for it. Can you tell us what happened on the day you left and the day you decided to leave your building?
Либо меня убьют там, либо меня убьют как бы на улице, но есть шанс выжить все-таки. Ну, сразу думала о смерти. Сразу же, да.
Sonia and her boyfriend, along with his father and grandmother, stepped out into the street, walked 6 miles through a war to a Russian evacuation point. From there, they were bused to Primorsk, where they stayed for 1 night in a school along with hundreds of others. The next day, they were brought to Donetsk. They were kept there for 11 days, sleeping in again a school building, and then brought to a police station in the city where they were interrogated.
Отпечатки пальцев брали, лицо, что-то там фотографировали, вот, и допрашивали, смотрели телефоны, все проверяли.
And during that interview, what questions did they ask you?
Что я знаю про военных, про военную технику, есть ли знакомые, ну и в принципе все. Женщина, которая там работала, сотрудница, сказала то, что тех людей, которые ничего не знают, будем отправлять в Мариуполь.
The men were separated from the women and checked for tattoos indicating military service or political involvement. From Donetsk, they then travelled about 100 miles by bus across the official border into Russia and the city of Taganrog, one of the main distribution points within Russia for refugees coming out of Mariupol. Their group was promised the equivalent of about £100 each in rubles and sent to the city of Astrakhan, 500 miles away. Sonia told us that a close relative was offered the equivalent of £2,000 to go all the way to Khabarovsk in the Far East. Back in Astrakhan, Sonia's group stayed in this building, a Soviet-style holiday facility repurposed before the war, as Russian media reported at the time. Here they were encouraged to apply for citizenship, which Sonia's boyfriend's family considered. But everything changed for her when news came through that her mother, who'd stayed in Mariupol, had been killed in the shelling.
И был, я так понимаю, обстрел, и ее убило осколком, она умерла за секунду. Вот, и получается, да, она умерла сразу, ее закопал ее молодой человек рядом с домом во дворе.
It was at this point that Sonia and her boyfriend decided to leave Russia for Estonia. Sonia's boyfriend asked not to be identified, as his family decided to stay in Russia. The young couple were not stopped from going. They went first to St. Petersburg, crossed the border and made it to Tallinn, where a volunteer network gave them accommodation.
Я бы себе просто не простила бы, если бы я бы находилась бы в России, зная то, что они убили мою маму, они поубивали столько людей, а я там нахожусь, плачу там налоги, деньги.
Sonia not only left Russia, but made it through the filtration centres in the first place. But what of those who do not? Back in the border town of Narva, we're on our way to an arts centre housing Ukrainian refugees. Vladimir, Yelena and their son Marka are stopping here for the night en route to Finland. They told us about a close friend of theirs. During the filtration process, it was discovered that he was a police officer in Mariupol.
Выяснилось, что он был полицейским, и его тоже отправили в Донецк. Что с ним было, мы его судьбу не знаем.
They do not know what has happened to their friend. There are reports of people who have disappeared after being screened at the filtration centres. Then there are those who never made it out of Mariupol at all, like Irina, Sonia's mother. She left a note under her daughter's door, not knowing she was hiding in the basement downstairs.
Сонечка, Даня, как все закончится, пожалуйста, приди ко мне. Я не знаю, где ты, я очень переживаю, мама.
Their last unanswered correspondence. Sonia carries it with her everywhere.
And that report was by Porrick O'Brien. Well, away from the front line, the diplomatic war of words is escalating. Western nations, including the US and the UK, are pledging to pump Ukraine full of defensive weaponry, while Russia says that doing so will provoke a lightning-fast response. These days, Bucha, where Ukrainian civilians were bound, shot and buried in mass graves, is a place where people come to face up to the horrors of war. Today it was the UN Secretary General's turn. Antonio Guterres calls himself a messenger of peace. The problem is nobody's listening. Indeed, the drums of war are beating ever louder across this continent and beyond. In Washington, Joe Biden's $33 billion military gift could also transform this conflict.
We either back Ukrainian people as they defend their country, or we stand by as the Russians continue their atrocities and aggression in Ukraine.
The announcement is a direct challenge to Vladimir Putin, who yesterday sent a chilling message to anyone who seeks to influence the outcome of the war.
If outsiders intend to intervene and create strategic threats for Russia, they should know that our retaliatory strikes will be lightning fast.
Here, the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, has called on Western nations to ramp up military production and force Russia's army out of Ukraine altogether. Today, when asked whether Liz Truss was wise to poke the Russian bear, the government doubled down.
You can't provoke a man who's invaded a country any further. Business isn't finished with just them leaving where they started on 22nd of February. Business is finished when he complies with international law and rulings and removes himself from the sovereign state of Ukraine.
As military stakes are raised, though, so too are the chances of a miscalculation or an outright escalation. So who blinks first? Or worse still, what if nobody blinks? Well, joining me now is the former Prime Minister of Finland, Alexander Stubb. Thank you very much for coming on the programme again. Do you think that this rather gung-ho rhetoric that we're hearing out of London and Washington is helpful at the moment, or does it run the risk of escalating this war?
I'm not too worried about it. I mean, I don't think it's going to be escalated that much. I think rhetoric and information wars are always part of these types of conflicts. And, you know, as we heard in the previous snippet, I don't think anything is holding Putin back at the moment.
Right. But do you think there is a danger of escalation right now?
You never know with Putin, to be honest. I think, you know, you always have three phases. One is the conventional warfare, which we're seeing. The other one is chemical, and the third one is nuclear. Nuclear option I don't believe in, because Putin is not suicidal. There'll be a lot of information wars going on, and we should prepare for that.
I mean, the Russians already say that they think they're at war with NATO. The government says it. The people believe it, apparently. Can we blame them for that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of disinformation around. We all know that Russia is not in war with NATO. It has attacked illegally Ukraine on the 24th of February. NATO and its member states have been providing arms to Ukraine. That's the best thing we can do at the moment. This is the type of intimidation that we are very used to from Russia, especially in Finland, because we've always been their neighbor.
But, you know, as there is a possibility of escalation, now you think it's remote, other people think it's slightly less remote, should we be thinking about the kind of avenues that this war might be going down? Should we be thinking more publicly about the various scenarios of the end of this war?
Well, to be honest, I have a feeling that within the international media, there's a little bit of war fatigue, and therefore people want to hype up the possibility of an escalation. I mean, Putin and his army at the moment...
This is a real possibility, isn't it?
No, I think that, you know, look at what Putin's army is doing at the moment. It is doing a really bad job in Ukraine. The idea of them escalating from a military or political perspective, I just don't see that happening. And there is a tendency of trying to hype up the situation and say that, well, this will be the next target. I don't think that's going to happen. He's got his hands full.
But hang on, we were accused, the media was accused of hyping up, you know, the possibility of war before the 24th of February. And guess what? Russia invaded, you know, not just the east of the country, but everywhere where it had troops. So which one is it? Realistic estimation of risks or hyping it up?
I think what the military, both nationally and internationally, is doing at the moment is to look at different options and scenarios. And I think they usually do a fairly good job at that. With the war starting, I think the Americans got it right, the Europeans got it wrong. Whether it is useful to hype up the situation through public discourse, I don't know. To be honest, I don't think Putin is following the international media very close.
Okay, but should we just ignore him then when he says things like, you know, weapons of undescribable destruction will rain down on you if you're not careful? Should we just ignore that?
Well, I think Finland has a 1,340-kilometer border with Russia. We know what Russia thinks, what it does, and when it acts. So let me give you one example. Medvedev, former president and prime minister, came out and said, we will move nuclear weapons to the Baltic Sea region if Finland and Sweden join NATO. Well, we sort of remind him that, listen, you already have them there. So really what the international media needs to do is to siphon out the information and not hype it up unnecessarily.
Okay, and finally and briefly, can we now expect Finland to join NATO anytime soon?
Oh, definitely. An application will be filed around the 15th, 16th and 17th of May together with Sweden. Then hopefully the NATO summit 29th and 30th of June will approve, and then the ratification process starts and Finland and Sweden will be members of NATO by the end of the year or early next year.
So that's one thing that Vladimir Putin has achieved.
Yeah, I think, no Schadenfreude on my side on that one.